All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Road to 18-inch Arms, episode number 3 today. So, first off, you'll see preacher curls. This is actually my final set of preacher curls for the week, even though it was my first set, because I am getting a bit of nagging pain in my forearms. My bones are actually aching, and it's been slowly building up for the past handful of weeks. And at this point, I kind of just hit my tipping point where it's not just a little nagging thing that I can kind of ignore that's just kind of part of the lifting game. This is actually getting to a point where it is enough pain to cause my set to stop a little bit early and really become a distraction. So it works out pretty well because my basement did flood, so I do have to go to the commercial gym anyways, so fair enough. I can rotate lifts pretty easily with a new variety of equipment that I have access to at the commercial gym. So that is where I'm at right now. As far as rates of progression, this is a question that I get pretty often and something I did want to spend part of this video addressing. A lot of people are asking what a normal rate of progression is in terms of performance, not necessarily the actual measurement of the arm itself, but when do you add reps? How often should you be adding reps to make sure you are making good progress in your program? And the answer to this is very simple. You need to add 5 reps per session each week, and from there you'll be growing pretty well. No, in reality, there's no way to properly answer this question because your progression on each lift is going to be individual based on the person. But in reality, I would say the best way to look at your progression in your arm growth is just to measure your arms. So when you have a muscle that's as simple and as easy to measure as your biceps and triceps, why not just default to the measurement? Why are you trying to reverse engineer your growth from your actual training when we're not even necessarily certain what the rate of progression needs to be for optimal arm growth, or which rate of progression reflects optimal arm growth the best? So I would say prioritize taking your measurements. Of course, there is room for error with measurements too. Nothing's perfect, but don't just rely on your training. Focus a lot on the measurements too. They are extremely valuable. I would say with rates of progression, you can use me for a little bit of an example here. So if you're going to be following along with this series, you'll see that roughly I add about 1 rep to one of my sets on most movements each week. And it's kind of tough to pinpoint my level of advancement. Like, I guess my physique is probably later stage intermediate. My arms are they're probably pretty much caught up to the rest of my physique at this point. They were obviously lagging for a very long time, but at this point they're 17 and a half or so. I wouldn't say they're really a weakness anymore, so you could say my arms are kind of, I guess, late stage intermediate, and they're kind of catching up, and someone at this point in their training is adding a rep to one set roughly each week. But to get back to progressions, the way I see it is if I'm adding roughly 1 rep per lift across any of my 2, 3, 1 set, whatever it is, per week, that's something that has been correlated with my arm growth. I would say if I was to go 2 weeks without adding a rep, I wouldn't sweat it. I wouldn't be worried at all. The only time I would be concerned about my progression is if I happened to not be making progress in terms of the actual measurement. So the progression for me, specifically with arms, is always going to be my it's always going to be my secondary measurement compared to the actual physical measurement itself. So definitely want to make that clear. Measurements are very straightforward for arms, so I think that they're the most valuable thing to go off of to track growth. I would also say that just focusing on rep progressions and weight progression in the gym isn't everything. With arms, I would say it's more valuable, especially if you use a relatively strict technique, because it's hard to really cheat your form and whatnot. But for myself personally, there have been a handful of lifts for arms where I could make decent progress, but I wasn't actually getting much growth. So if I was just picking a less potent lift and I was adding reps and assumed my arms were growing, and I checked my measurements and they were stalling out, then you would think something's entirely wrong. But at the same time, some lifts just aren't that potent. Like if I'm adding a rep to a very short and biased lift, so the resistance profile's all out of whack, maybe I'm leaving a rep or 2 in the tank and I'm just not getting enough potent stimulus to be adding S size regularly, but I'm good enough at the movement to where I'm adding a rep every week or every 2 or 3 weeks. At that point, that's where progressions in your training aren't necessarily perfect too. They do have their own flaws. Arm training to a lesser extent, but it's not perfect, and I always do recommend taking measurements. I know at this point I'm beating a dead horse, so let me move on to a couple more questions that I got in the last video. So another interesting question to me that other people seem to agree with was, should you always stick to a programmed lift that you have, or can you switch it up if you feel like it? So there's a bit of a protocol I have for lift rotations and substitutions based on a few different factors. So what you're seeing here in this scenario, it's a combination of, one, I'm rotating a couple lifts temporarily while I deal with this nagging forearm bone pain slash ache. And you're also seeing me have a bit of a situation issue where I can't really use my basement gym because it's flooded. So one, I have access to different equipment, so for fun it might be nice to switch it up, especially since it's just for a week. This is a good time to switch things up, where if you're traveling, or if your basement gym floods and you have to go to the commercial gym too, if you're in a different situation for a week, that's a good time to change things up just for fun. It can also be a bit of a proactive deload in a sense. So what I'm doing here, temporary rotations to relieve certain pain that I'm feeling on a specific lift. Let me go into a couple more examples to give you how my approach would be in various examples of lift rotation. So the first one would be, if you're feeling a nagging pain on a certain lift, not necessarily in a certain muscle or joint across the board, but from a very specific lift. So for me, forearm pain in preacher curls, I would do a temporary rotation, so to a lift that can still train that muscle but doesn't give you that nagging pain, just for a week, maybe 2 weeks tops. That should be fine, and then you could be able to go back to your normal lift. If you're someone that is either a little bit less serious, or you'd rather be a little bit more cautious with the actual potential injury itself, you could always opt for a deload. In a deload situation, I would either go 50% weight for 2 sets of roughly 10, depending on what your rep range is typically, or I would just skip the movement altogether and save yourself some time in the gym. This is a perfectly fine way to go about it, especially for low skill lifts like most lifts for the arms. Another situation would be if you do have an acute injury from a specific lift, I would deload. So take a week off depending on the movement. If it is a more complex movement, you could actually do a legit deload where you just go roughly half weight for 2 sets of roughly 10 reps to keep your skill down in the lift. And then from there, once you come back from the deload, I would simply rotate lifts to something that will work around that specific injury, whether you were able to recover in the deload or you'll just need to train a movement that allows you to recover while still training the target muscle. That works perfectly fine as well. If you're feeling bored on a certain lift, so you can somewhat apply this to my situation now where I wasn't feeling bored, but I was traveling. So if you're feeling bored for a little bit or you're traveling, this is okay to do a temporary rotation, so maybe try a new lift for a week, maybe 2 weeks. This is totally fine just to keep things fresh and keep things exciting, or if you don't have access to certain equipment, this is totally fine. What I'd recommend is, if you're very serious about your goals and you're in a good groove with your training, pick something that's a close variation, specifically with the resistance profile. So if I was doing preacher curls, it wouldn't be a smart idea for me to go to spider curls because I'm very detrained in that resistance profile. So switching to that preacher curl-esque machine that you saw me doing earlier, which is a beautiful machine by Arsenal, by the way, have to give them a shout out, that has the same resistance profile as a preacher curl. It's a different lift, but I was trained in that resistance profile, in that movement pattern, so it works well for me. That was a very easy adaptation for me on that specific lift, so it was very potent right off the bat. Final situation I have here, if you have a plateau in growth or your reps, so your measurements and your performance isn't increasing, and you've already been adjusting your volume, so if you're training with high volume, if you've already tried lowering the volume and vice versa, this is when you can rotate that lift permanently / indefinitely. So if the lift isn't working for you anymore, your technique's in check, your intensity is good, you've already tried manipulating the volume, then going into a permanent rotation could actually work quite well in that situation. And the last question that I wanted to answer today is, someone was asking what my end goal for arm size is, and this is actually something that I haven't really thought about a whole ton for a couple different reasons. So the first one being, long-term goals like that, like super long-term goals that are a little bit blurry and almost unclear aren't that motivating to me personally. I've had some people disagree with that. I think most people disagree with that quite a bit. I just think that realistic goals that you can hit in a shorter time frame are super motivating. So that's why my Road to 18-inch arm series is kind of becoming a thing now, where I'm half an inch away from it versus when I had 16 and a half inch arms. So now that it's realistic and it's something that I can attain hopefully pretty quickly, at least in terms of lifting timelines, now it's more motivating than it ever was, even when I was a beginner, intermediate, early intermediate lifter. Like at this point, it's just a realistic, interesting goal that really does intrigue me. And if I was to say, all right, my goal is to hit 20-inch arms, this is the Road to 20-inch arm series, whether that's possible for me or not one day is kind of besides the point, but it's almost just so far down the road that it's hard to be excited for that, because I know that comes with multiple cut and bulk cycles, that comes with so much other stuff that just makes the process take so much longer. So having something realistic like 18 inches, I would say, is pretty motivating. And for anybody else that's looking to set a specific goal, I would say set your goal to the nearest inch or the nearest half inch. If you're a beginner lifter and your arms are, say, 12 inches, 12 and a half, 13 inches, set your goal for the next half inch, maybe that next inch, and that's something that you can achieve relatively quickly if you're doing things properly, and it's going to be pretty motivating. Each time you complete one of those goals, you're just getting one step closer to having massive arms. And the way I see it is, once you hit something like a 15-inch arm, that's something you should be extremely proud of. Same with 16, that's even more impressive, obviously. 17 is insanely big. 18 is like the pinnacle. I think that's a very impressive measurement, and that's why it motivates me so much to try and get there. And then if I was to try and get 19 or 20, that's almost a situation where I'd be so happy and so proud of hitting 18 that hitting something like 19 or maybe 20 down the road is almost like the icing on the cake, where I feel like it wouldn't even be as motivating because I've already proven to myself that I have what it takes to achieve an impressive measurement like 18 or so. So with that being said, that is all I've got for today. Any questions or anything you want to see covered in the next episode, let me know in the comments here. I will see you guys in episode number 4.